Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Over and Over Again by Cole Mccade, narrated by Philip Alces. 1. Luca Ward's parents said goodbye to him at Sheffield railway station. Luca didn't say it back. They'd not even bothered coming inside the station with him. Instead, they stood in front of that giant fucking urinal of a fountain in the square and made mealy-mouthed mumbles about seeing him in January. Fresh farm air. It was for his own good. His Uncle Imre couldn't wait to see him. "He's not my uncle," Luca hissed. "We're not even related. I haven't seen him in 10 fucking years." "But Luca..." "Admit it. He's just some stranger you're foisting me off on because you don't want to deal with me yourself." His father hunched his narrow shoulders, sighing and fidgeting with his pencil-thin tie. His ties always made him look like he was choking, squeezing his neck too small until his head ballooned atop the willow lathe of his body. "I don't know what to do with you anymore, Luca. I'm at the end of my rope. Try not shipping me off like some bloody criminal." His mother, his little golden apple of a mother, with her way of talking with her hands as though shaping flowing waves and moving clouds, reached for him. "Now don't be dramatic, dear. You used to love the farm, and it's beautiful out there in the dales. If you're going to send me to the arse-crack of nowhere, it could have been Scarborough. At least they've proper beaches." His father's lips thinned into a flat black dash. "This isn't a vacation. This is punishment. This is discipline. You need to grow up. I'm a fucking adult. Adults don't steal a bloody motorcycle and leave it crashed out in front of the Peter and Paul." Lucas stared at his father. Marco Ward's chest heaved, the colour spotted high in his cheeks, his eyes bright. His father was like that, a thin and sensitive man, wispy enough to blow away with the wind, quiet even in his anger. Yet that quiet was what made his fury so powerful, when he choked on his emotions and trembled as though he'd break down at any moment. Luca's mother fretted between them with those wordless, helpless sounds she made when she wanted to knock their heads together, but meant to let them work it out for themselves. There was no hope Luca Ward would step in and turn this wreck aside before it crashed. Not when this had been her fucking idea, tossing him out like the trash. His father sighed, shoulders sagging. "I'm out of options, son. You're giving me no choice. The only alternative was to press charges, but I'm not ready to give up on you yet. It took fast talking to keep the church from prosecuting. If you want to be an adult, you can be tried as an adult. If you want to be reckless, you have to deal with how I choose to save your arse. But if you refuse to go, there's nothing I can do but to leave you to deal with your own consequences." Luca's gut heaved, then turned cold. The threat didn't need to be any clearer. He turned away. "Whatever. I need a break from your dysfunctional horse shite anyway. Sort yourselves the fuck out, will you? You're a fucking disgrace." He walked away from his parents, leaving them standing in the mid-September sun like Jack Spratt and his wife, 2 pins stuck in the Sheffield station square, and holding it in place. "I love you, dearling," his mother called. "Do try to dress warm." "We'll see you in January, son," his father added. Luca tossed a middle finger over his shoulder, stuffed his earbuds in, turned up the white stripes, and stepped into the shadow of the brick arches fronting the station's facade. Whatever. They wanted to ship him off like a damned prisoner. They hated him so much they couldn't be asked to drive to Harrogate themselves. They could go rot. Would serve them right if he never came back at all. 2. Imre Claybourne crouched over a bag of seed, one knee planted in the cool earth beneath the shadow of the open barn door. With one hand he sifted a clover and alfalfa seed mix between his fingers, little green-gold kernels indistinguishable, save for minor differentiations in shape and size. Their dusty, earthy scent wafted up with each handful that spilled back into the sack. His other hand steadied his cell phone, just barely catching it before it could slip from between his shoulder and ear, narrowly saving it from a swim in the seed bag. "It's barely a minute to town, Marco," he said. "No bother at all. I'll nip right out, fetch him from the station, and be back afield within the hour." On the other end of the line, Marco Ward sighed, his breaths crackling against the speaker. "Thank you for this, Imre. I'm at my wit's end with that boy. He sounds a bit like you at that age. I never stole. Anything but your dad's rum." Marco laughed, yet it was tired, strained. "I'd have let it go, even if I loved that bike, but the Pole wanted to nab him for destruction of public property. He crashed the bloody thing into a church. If I'd not been friends with a few of the locals, he'd be in cuffs. The boy's on a fast track to hell at this rate." "Let St. Peter worry about that when the time comes," Imre chuckled. "He's 19, not a child. We still did daft things when we were 19. Uni worked out those wild oats well enough for both of us. If he'd just go to uni, I'd be less worried. But he's intent on making his gap year a gap life." Exhaling, Imre sank back on his haunches and checked his watch. Luca's train would be pulling into Harrogate on the line north in about an hour and a half, and Imre still had an acre to till. Might just put it off until Luca was in and settled. Planting could wait another day. Alfalfa and clover grew quickly, and the herds would trim it down even faster, well before the frost set in. Could just take the day off, he thought. Spend a little time with Luca. He'd be upset, no doubt. Luca had always been a brightly passionate boy, quick to smile, quick to cry. God knew what he was like now. Imre hadn't seen Luca since he was a sober 9-year-old, one whose quick, brilliant smiles had already begun to disappear behind a careful silence and downcast eyes by the time the Wards had cast off and put Harrogate at their backs. He'd hated to see it. Some people were born with a thick skin. Some developed it over time. Luca had been born with skin like paper and a crystal heart. He took everything into himself and transformed it into raw emotion that shone and bled from him in this vivid kaleidoscope of colour. Every love, every loss, every joy, every hurt. Back when Marco and Lucia had lived closer in Harrogate proper, they'd been out at Imre's farm every other week. In those days Luca had been a pinwheel of animated energy, tumbling through the clover with soft white flowers dappled in the dark shock of his hair, his laughter echoing over the farm. The problem with feeling things so deeply, though, was feeling them hard, taking the wounds, and if those wounds had already made Luca sober and quiet by the time the Wards had moved away to Sheffield 10 years ago. Imre worried what kind of seething, angry mass of scar tissue was about to show up on his doorstep as a grown man. He straightened, brushing the dirt from the knees of his jeans, and leaned in the barn door, looking out over the fields. His goats, primarily spry, tooth-edged alpines, a few Nubians scattered in the mix, milled in their walled pastures, gnawing at the last crop of alfalfa and clover, bleating and bouncing among themselves. The scent of fresh clover blooms was high and sweet. Fat, furry bees swam through it, nearly drunk on the aroma. He couldn't help a faint smile. Luca used to bounce about just like the goats. Surely that vivid spirit couldn't be completely broken. "It'll be all right, Marco," he murmured into the phone. "He just needs some time to cool off. Away from you. No doubt you're public enemy number 1 right now." "God, am I? No one told me when you had kids they'd love you until they hated you." "He's just trying to assert himself as a separate person from you and Lucia, an adult." "Then he shouldn't act like a damned boy." Imre smiled to himself. "Give it time. You can say that. You don't have children of your own. You don't know what it's like." "I suppose I don't." And Imre doubted Marco would want to hear much else. He didn't think Marco realized just how much he was like his own son, quiet and sensitive, yet hot-headed and passionate, willing to listen to no law but his own. "I'd best go if I'm to make it to the station on time. I'll take good care of Luca, you have my word." "At this point, I'd be grateful if you put a few stripes on his hide," Marco groaned. "I don't mean that, I don't. Just thank you, Imre. I know it's an imposition. It's no such thing. I'll let you know when he's settled in. Thank you. Lucia sends her love. Send mine back, Imre said, then ended the call with a swipe of his thumb, slipped his phone into his pocket, and folded his arms over his chest with a heavy sigh. He'd said it was no trouble, but in truth he had no idea what to do with Luca Ward. The bright, laughing boy he remembered wasn't the man being dropped in his lap in disgrace. He didn't know what to expect when he saw Luca again. But as he watched the goats, he remembered pale flower flecks against a crown of dark hair, and thought perhaps he could welcome Luca not to a jail sentence, but to a home. 3. Luca slept through to the transfer at Leeds. At Leeds station he scrambled through the busy concourse, twice as large and crowded as Sheffield. He had 10 minutes to make the second train from Leeds to Harrogate. He was tempted to miss it. Just disappear into Leeds. It was a big enough city. He could vanish anywhere and everywhere, sleep on park benches, live wild, survive on 50p cup noodles, get a job as a barista or some such, and find himself at a tiny windowless flat in some shithole back alley, miserable but his. Stop being Luca Ward and just be Luca. The idea shouldn't have such appeal, but he'd been thinking about it for months. Some days he felt like his heart was a bird with clipped wings, and flying was just a memory it was terrified of forgetting. That was what had been so beautiful about that moment on the motorcycle. Hands up, hundreds of pounds of steel and burning petrol careening down the road, gravity gone and Luca weightless, flying as if he could lift up on wings and send the bird of his heart soaring away. But there was platform 17B, and the second train from Leeds to Harrogate already waiting. He double-checked his ticket, then hefted his hefty duffel and strode for the closest carriage, stretching his legs. 10-minute transfers were utter balls, but he scrambled on with a few minutes to spare. The carriage was half empty, dotted with bored-looking people in plain, dull colours, scattered about like bits of seed strewn for pecking hens. A few glanced up at him, but didn't quite look at him, just dully registering his presence before returning blank stares to the windows, as if there was anything to see on an unmoving line. He found a seat in the very back row, shoved his bag into the overhead bin, then slumped down in the bucket chair against the window with his earbuds shoved in. Leeds was so noisy, but Shawn Mendes crooned in Luca's ear, drowning it all out with aching pleas for someone to have mercy on him and his heart. A few more seats filled in a shuffling of feet and luggage. The doors cranked closed. The train screamed out a shrill whistle and rumbled around him. A jerk of momentum jolted him as the carriage rolled forward, wheels grinding and squealing against the tracks. This was it. Last chance to turn tail and run slipping through his fingers, the doors locking and sealing him in. He rubbed at his chest, at the tight low pain there, rested his too-hot brow to the cool window pane, and swallowed a breath that lodged in his throat. Leeds station slid past slowly, then faster and faster, until the train arrowed through bright flashes of morning sun off rooftops. He wanted to go home already. He wanted his parents to just let him be. He'd thought it would serve them right if he didn't come back, but they were probably glad to see him gone. He was someone else's problem now. Maybe they'd be happier if he never came back. His phone buzzed, cutting off the music track, and cutting off the prickle in his eyes before it could become anything more. He rummaged his phone from his pocket and swiped through the latest text. Xavier. Luca laughed under his breath. That motherfucker. You there yet? Xav texted. Luca dotted his thumb over the screen, swiping out quick letters. Not yet. I almost didn't go at all. Could have run away in Leeds. At least it's a proper city. Harrogate's not so bad. Pretty even. Luca smiled, though he didn't really feel like it. That was how Xav had always been, bright side to everything. It had driven Luca through the roof during A-levels, and that was the only thing that got him through A-levels. Xavier Lagari and his wide smile and bright black eyes in that pert brown face. Xavier was lucky. He was smart, charming, easygoing, and everyone liked him. Of course he could look at the bright side of everything. For him, every side was the bright side. But it was Xavier's bright side that had made Luca's life tolerable, and now he didn't even have Xav when Luca's parents had just ripped him away from his friends, his life, everything he'd had in Sheffield. "Don't try to make me feel better," he texted back. "It just pisses me off. I'm not even staying in Harrogate. I'm going to a farm somewhere in the backwoods." "Maybe you can feed the ducks." Lucas scowled at the phone. "You taking the piss?" "Always," Xav shot back. Luca could almost see that cheeky damned grin. "Don't make too many friends there. I'll get jealous." "Yeah, I'll make friends with all the fucking pigs mucking around in the mud." With a snort, Luca closed the text window and tapped play on his music again. The track skipped forward to Bad Reputation and his side, sinking down in his seat and letting his eyes half close until the hard blue light of morning became a haze, and the buildings streaked by in vague dashes of colour. He had a bad fucking reputation, all right. His father had probably called Imre already and filled his head with stories of what a degenerate reprobate Luca was. He flushed hotly and sank down deeper in his seat. Unca Imi. Though they weren't related by blood, and Imre was just a friend of Luca's father from uni, for as long as Luca could remember he'd called him Unca Imi. Until around 8 or so he'd declared himself too old for such childish bon mots and begun pronouncing Imre so very gravely. He could hardly even remember what Imre looked like. He was more a collection of impressions than a solid mental image. Luca used to clamber all over him like a great broad-limbed oak tree. To a tiny boy, Imre had seemed a massive monolith, 10 feet tall and broad as a mountain, with a thick nest of beard. Luca had always climbed in Imre's lap and tangled his fingers in that long, lustrously black scruff, stroking the soft strands, and playing with the few tiny braids woven throughout, each tipped in small blue beads to match the slender, bead-tipped braids strung throughout the untamed mane of Imre's hair. Those beads had been the same blue as Imre's eyes. That was his clearest memory, how startlingly clear a blue Imre's eyes were against his swarthy, weathered skin. That and the kindness in his hands. He'd had massive hands, hands that could crush granite to dust, this great dark earthen god with the strength of stone. But he'd handled everything, from his tiny bleating goat kids to the smallest clover flower to Luca himself, with a gentleness that flowed from his hands like water, imbued with a living warmth. And Luca had been in love with him, the way only little boys could be. He still remembered sitting on Imre's lap when he was 5 years old, snuggled in the heavy rocking chair before the living-room fireplace at Imre's farm. Blue walls. The room had deep blue walls, painted in varying shades over rough stone, turning the space into a dark blue night lit by the flicker of firelight. Soft illumination shining like honey off the polished wood of the guitar propped on the mantel. Luca's parents had been tangled on the couch, wrapped up in each other and cuddling under a quilt stitched in patterns of zigzags and dots and knotted loops, drowsy yet so contentedly in love. Luca had curled up in Imre's lap like a puppy, clinging to his beard and his shirt, fighting off sleep though his eyes refused to stay open. But he'd had a secret in his pocket, one he'd worked on all day, then hidden away in his jumper. And as the deep, heavy swelling of Imre's lazy sigh had moved his chest and stomach against Luca's cheek, Luca had opened his eyes, peeking at his parents to make sure they were really asleep, before rummaging in his pocket and pulling out his secret, a ring made of braided blades of grass. He'd had to make it a whole 11 to 12 times before it came out right, because the grass would break and splinter, or one strand would be too short, or it was just too small, because Imre had hands big enough to hold the world. But now it was perfect, a thin, flat band of interwoven strands making chevron patterns. He'd made it because that was what people did when they loved people. he'd thought. His parents had. They loved each other, so they had rings. So he'd made a ring too, smooth and pretty, and he'd tucked it away again and run his thumb over its textures before taking a deep breath and looking up at Imre. "Immy?" he'd asked, biting his lip. His mouth tasted funny, like he'd been sucking on pennies. Imre had rumbled a soft, curious sound, and looked down at him with those eyes as gentle as his hands, surrounded by seams and folds that settled his gaze into a cradle of warmth, softening the forbidding crags of dark, heavy brows. "What is it, Anjolka?" he'd asked, his deep, richly inflected English altering into something more melodious and smooth on the Hungarian word. Luca had taken a breath so massive it tried to burst his chest, then announced, "I'm going to marry you one day." Imre had blinked, then laughed low in his throat, the sound so large yet so quiet, shaking them both. "Oh, you know. And why is that?" "Because I love you." Luca had put as much conviction into the words as he could, more confidence than he'd felt when his ears burned and his bare toes curled until they caught in the denim over Imre's thighs. "Mummy and Daddy love each other, and they got married. I love you, so I'm going to marry you." Imre's gaze had softened, and he'd gently dropped one of those massive hands atop Luca's head, playing through his hair. 5 years old is very young to be so serious about marriage." "I mean it." Luca had ducked his head, fidgeting his lower lip with his fingers, then gulped and pulled the ring from his pocket again. "I'm going to grow up, and I'm going to be tall and handsome, and then you'll love me too, and we'll get married." Tilting his head, Imre had studied the ring solemnly. In the firelight, the edges of the ring had gleamed like spun gold fibre. "There's a problem with that." Luca's heart had turned upside down. It was an awful feeling, a sick feeling, and he'd dropped his hands into his lap, staring down at the silly, pointless little ring. "Oh." "The problem," Imre had said, catching his hand, swallowing it inside his own until Luca's fingers and the ring disappeared into a thick palm, "is that I already love you, Anjolka." A sharp breath had sucked into Luca's throat. Imre had uncurled his hand and gently grasped Luca's and guided him, still gripping the ring so tight, to slip the ring over Imre's third finger on his left hand. It had fit just right, sliding over his thickly ridged, scarred knuckle and settling into place nestled at the base of his finger. Luca had smiled so much his face hurt with it, and flung his arms round Imre's shoulders, burying his face in his neck and his beard. "I'm always gonna love you, Immy," he'd whispered, and Imre had chuckled again and wrapped his arms around him, holding him just tight enough. "I know you will, Anjolka. I know." The memory of that night, the firelight in Imre's eyes, the sweet light flutters of Luca's heart, sank in his chest. He huddled down deeper in the train seat. He'd been such a ridiculous child. Imre had been kind to him, patiently indulging him and not crushing his 5-year-old heart, but that had been 14 years ago. Imre probably still saw him as that same earnest, simple little boy, full of nonsense ideas and making promises he'd never keep, unrealistic and completely confused. He'd be right about one thing. Luca was completely and utterly confused, and not sure what to do with himself. Not on that fucking farm, and not when Imre got sick of him and shipped him back home without a single damned thing having changed. With a groan, he leaned forward, thunking his forehead against the seat in front of him. Why, of all people, did it have to be Imre? "Hey!" the man in the row before him barked. "Watch it back there." "Sorry," Luca mumbled and curled in on himself, burying his face in his knees with a low moan. Fuck. He couldn't even manage a train ride without stirring up trouble. The next 4 months would be miserable. 4. Eventually Luca settled into the train's lull, the sound of the rails mingling with the pulse and rock and cadence of his music, hypnotizing him into a drifting thrall that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't quite awake. He snapped from it only long enough to show the conductor his ticket as she passed through before slipping into a trance again, silently mouthing lyrics and trying to ignore the heavy weight on his chest. After passing beneath the castle-like arches and towers of the Bramhope tunnel entrance, he drifted off fully. The darkness of the tunnel and the rhythmic flash of running lights eased him into a fitful doze, his phone clutched against his chest and his head resting against the window. He woke as the train shot from the tunnel and light splashed over him, searing through his eyelids and shocking him awake. He opened his eyes on a blaze of white, stabbing into his retinas and blinding him. With a wince, he turned his face away and covered his eyes with his arm, blinking until he adjusted to the light. The white haze cleared, replaced by green and gold and brilliant autumn fire. Rolling fields that swooped up and down like the crests and troughs of waves, plunging high only to sweep gracefully low, stroked as smooth as the flick of a calligraphy brush. Deep pink and rich purple edged the green, catching the light in soft streaks, glimmering beneath a sky of endless blue and low, silver-bellied clouds. Tumbles of pale grey limestone pushed up through the grass like fragments of ancient ruins. The Yorkshire dales swept past, segmented into fields by hedgerows, lines of trees, low fencing walls built of hand-stacked worn river stones in white and grey. Small blocky barns with white sides and peaked roofs scattered all about. At the peak of one hill the sun shone in bursts through the legs of grazing cattle. Luca's eyes widened. He pressed his fingers to the window, breathing in slowly. He'd never seen the dales like this. During his childhood in Harrogate, the verdant acreage had been a close and ordinary thing. The last time he'd seen the dales had been through a window, just a crevice of sky blocked off by stacks of moving boxes in the back of a truck. A heavy feeling struck hard in the pit of his stomach, at once sweet and swimming with a certain quiet, thrashing terror. A feeling of coming home, when Harrogate hadn't been home for 10 years. He didn't even remember his old address, the house where they'd lived, as more than an after-image of sunlight through overgrown trees his dad had always promised to trim from their tiny patch of backyard, but never did. Everything else about Harrogate was just impressions. Weekends on Imre's farm, weekdays running and playing with other children in the neighbourhood, all sticky fingers and red balloons and little legs pumping on bike pedals. Coming back now, 10 years older and city-wiser, made him feel like an imposter. He didn't belong here. It may have been home once, but it couldn't be now. But he still remembered the ugly, overly modern Harrogate railway station sticking out like a raw sore against the town's graceful, historic architecture, villas and tree-lined roadways. He groaned as the carriage pulled into the station, easing to a halt with a lurch and a grinding squeal of railway brakes. While the conductor called disembarkation stops and times, Luca dragged himself out of his seat, wincing when his body protested with shooters of pain lashing through his limbs and crawling up his spine. He stretched it out, groaning as he pulled his muscles loose, then tugged his earbuds out, hauled his bag down from the bin and slung it over his shoulder. His legs didn't want to work right. His body told him gravity swayed back and forth with the rhythm of inertial motion, but the train was at a standstill, while he tripped over his feet like a puppy trying to figure out what to do with his oversized paws. He nearly tangled his boots together on the steps down to the platform, and barely caught himself from pitching forward by grabbing onto the doorframe. Yet hands caught him before he even managed to grip the frame. Large, warm hands, thick-fingered and gentle, radiating a familiar heat. He stiffened as those hands slowly drew him down the steps and set him to rights, handling him as if he were little more than dandelion fluff, light and spinning and wheeling as freely as his spinning, wheeling heart. He'd thought he'd have to go searching for Imre, but as his feet came down to earth and settled on the platform, he stared up into clear, steady blue eyes he knew as well as he knew his own face. Imre had come to him. He was still
Sample complete. Ready to continue?